This is going to be how we make a sleeve cuff for a jacket. I will show different methods, a few different methods and personal preferences when I make the jacket, but I don't want the first sleeve cuff you have to make up to be the one on your jacket, so here you go. We start with some doubled up fabric, at least 30 centimeters by 50 centimeters. Along the bottom edge, we want to make an inclined line, as shown, at least 5 centimeters away from the raw edges. Take 2 points, one at the bottom of this line, and measure up the line at least 11 centimeters. From both points, make a perpendicular line up the cloth, only for the first 10 centimeters or so, and then carry on that line a bit in a curve to simulate the sleeve pattern. Below the hem, measure 5 centimeters. Make a right angle line from the bottom point of the line you just drew. From the line that we drew from the top point of the hem, make a line 5 centimeters away from the top of the sleeve. We can mark the top of the vent about 10 centimeters away from the top mark on the original line for a normal 4-button cuff. From about the top of the vent, make a 2.5 centimeter line away from the top of the sleeve. This will be inlay that we'd put on the sleeve pattern. Join that up to the 5 centimeter line we drew a second ago with just a diagonal dash between them. Importantly, above the top of the vent. We will cut around the perimeter of the outermost chalk now. Since we would mark stitch most of these lines, I am going to instead use my ruler, place it next to the chalk lines, move the layers of fabric out of the way, and draw the chalk along the fabric following the ruler to mark the lines onto both sides of both pieces. On the top piece, I will continue the diagonal line we made to the top of the sleeve seam. We'll cut this small portion of fabric away from just one piece to create the distinction between the top sleeve and the undersleeve. The one that we cut the piece away from is the top sleeve. I will mark a T on what will be the inside of the sleeve, and I will mark a U on the wrong side of the undersleeve. I'm putting the two sleeves on top of doubled up lining that is about the same size as the original cloth, and I'm lining up the grain about as best I can, giving it some pins and cutting around it flush. Separate the two pieces of lining. We need to cut the top sleeve a little more. Just keep the undersleeve piece. Lay the top sleeve piece onto one of the linings. We are going to copy off the rest of the original sleeve pattern we vaguely drafted. We are cutting away the 5 centimeter bit we added on top and the 2.5 centimeters we added on the rest. Very importantly, leaving the 5 centimeters below the hem. On the undersleeve, we need to chalk the sleeve seam above the top of the cuff that we marked. We will also mark the top of the surgeon cuff. We can put the lining aside for now. We place the two sleeve pieces right sides together, the sides that we haven't marked the T and U on. We are sewing along the seam that doesn't have the extra 5 centimeters and 2.5 centimeters. I include a cut of me basting this here, but I removed it because I hadn't cut the lining yet and didn't put it back later. We sew the seam with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. We don't need to back tack at all on this sample, and we don't need to back tack at the bottom of the hem at all. We'll iron the seam flat first. Open up the two pieces and lay the undersleeve flat on our, ironing board and open up the seam allowance. I use a bit of water on the seam to help me press the seam open and keep it open. We need Silecia now. We are going to lay the sleeve onto the Silecia on the bias. This will strengthen the sleeve. Being on the bias, it won't inhibit the sleeve as much as it would otherwise. We need to trace around the sleeve. We need to trace the Silecia a few centimeters above the top of the surgeon cuffs. Trace either side flush, and at the hem, copy 1 centimeter or so inside of the raw edge. I mark a small U on the undersleeve side so that I don't have to think about which side is which. I'm laying the Silecia back onto the sleeve as I cut it. There are 3 basic ways of attaching the Silecia. The first is to place your ruler underneath one of the seam allowances and securely baste the Silecia to the seam allowance. The second is basically the same, but hand sewing it with regular sewing thread. The third is basting it down and moving the rest of the sleeve out of the way to machine the Silecia to the seam allowance. When it's attached to the seam allowance, however you've done it, get the cuff flat and the Silecia flat on top of it to baste along the top to hold it up. I'll mark the T and the U on the outside now to make it very clear how we're going to mark each side. We can start with the top sleeve and mark 1 centimeter from the sleeve draft, from the raw edge down to the hem. We can make sure that the top of the vent is clearly marked as well. Quite similarly on the undersleeve, we will mark 1 centimeter from the inlay, from a bit above the top of the vent down to the raw edge of the hem. From this line, very importantly only on the undersleeve, measure 4 centimeters from the line that we just drew and mark that onto the 5 centimeters of inlay we added. Now we are going to check and adjust the hem of the sleeve. Take the top sleeve and line the mark showing the top of the surgeon cuff to the mark showing the top of the, surgeon cuff on the undersleeve. With the hem of the top sleeve clearly marked, I line up the 1 centimeter line we chalked on the undersleeve and re-chalk the hemline a tiny amount further up than the top sleeve. This way, it will be hidden behind the top sleeve when they are put together. Gently rejoin the marginally elevated line to the rest of the hem. On the undersleeve, we will fold the inlay over along the line 4 centimeters from the 1 centimeter line we chalked inside of the pattern. On the top sleeve, we will simply fold the fabric along the 1 centimeter line we chalked inside of the pattern, only extending a little bit up the sleeve beyond the top of the vent. Before we fold the raw edge of the hem upwards, what we can do is incline the undersleeve edge below the hem of the sleeve pattern we drafted. This will keep it hidden as we put up the hem. The extra fabric that will bunch up where we bend the edge will shrink in easily. We only need to do this on the undersleeve side. We will fold up the hem along the chalk line that we drew and iron it as we go. On the top sleeve side, we are folding a mitre, so fold a triangle into the cuff and iron that down. Now we need to do an important test. We need to make sure that the button stand on the undersleeve is shorter than the inlay folded back on the top sleeve. Lay the top sleeve up to the 1 cm line, aligning the tops of the vents. Fold the button stand on the undersleeve that's extending out over onto the top sleeve. We need to still be able to see the top sleeve fabric. If we can't, then we might have cut too little inlay at the cuff on the top sleeve, or the button stand is too long. We can easily shorten the button stand. I'm now unfolding what I just folded. We should stitch the bottom of the Silecia to the bottom of the hem. I'm taking my normal machine thread and I am fastening the thread to one side near the bottom of the Silecia. I am prick stitching across. It might have been better to do this before I did the ironing, but I had forgotten. Fasten the thread on the other side. The Silecia should be held in place at the bottom now. Refolding the cuff now. We will baste the raw hem up. We can start on either side, up the first edge across near the top of the raw edge. It would be best if, as we basted, we held the corners in a little curve to prevent them from perking outwards when we're finished. Better demonstrated as I'm sewing the mitre side down. To make sure we get the linings sewn together correctly, we can place the undersleeve piece of lining onto the undersleeve. The undersleeve lining being the one with the extruding piece at the bottom, and the undersleeve piece being the one with the extruding piece at the bottom. Take the top sleeve lining, which is the plain one, and we can place it on top of the other lining. I'm going to put a pin in the top of the seam that we'll be sewing, starting with the plain seam again. Again, 1 cm seam allowance. For the sample, we don't need to back tack at the top, it doesn't matter, and we don't need to back tack at the bottom either. I'm going to press the seam flat before opening the lining and pressing the seam allowances to the undersleeve side, both of them. I will then fold the top sleeve lining back onto the undersleeve to line the second edge up to the chalk line we drew when we cut the first lining. We know the top and bottom raw edges of the lining are supposed to line up, so we will line them up properly. If we don't line them up properly, the lining would drag one way or another, which we don't want. I am clearly marking on the top of the vent because we don't want to sew any further down than that. We will sew it with a 1 cm seam allowance from the top sleeve lining. Keep the top sleeve lined up to the chalk line we marked on the undersleeve. We don't need to back tack at the top, but we mustn't back tack at the bottom. We should not back tack at the top of the vent that we marked. That is important so that we can unpick a little bit if we need to later. We are pressing this seam too. You can put it on a sleeve board, or I have my plank of wood, pressing the seam allowances towards the top sleeve so that the inlay is on top. We need to hand stitch the hem up onto the cuff. Start with fastening thread on one side. I'm starting with the undersleeve on the button stand, fastening the thread and felling the folded edge to the folded edge of the sleeve. We do not want this stitch to show on the outside, which should be easy since there's 2 layers of Silecia under the layer of fabric that we're felling onto. Again, we want to hold the corners in a slightly inward facing curve to prevent it from sticking out at all. At the top, we want to tack the thread a little, and without bothering to start a new stitch, we can start cross-stitching the raw edge of the top sleeve to the Silecia. It's important, as always, that the stitches don't show on the outside, so we are sewing through the raw edge and the Silecia, and that's it. At the top of the other side, the mitre, in this case, We can once again tack the thread so that we don't need to start a new stitch. We will fell down the mitre a few stitches, still holding the corner in a slight curve. We will make a couple of stitches down before changing direction to make a semicircle in the mitre. We are sewing the half moon shape to facilitate the buttonholes in a standard 4-button cuff. Stitch through as much as possible without showing on the outside. When we get to the other end of the half moon on the folded edge of the mitre, we will fell the rest of the way down to the very corner of the cuff and moor the thread there. I'm hiding the tail of the thread between 2 layers of the cloth. I remove the basting now because we don't need it, and you can see that the semicircle in the mitre is open. Inside of the button stand, on the undersleeve, we need to mark the top of the surgeon cuff. We can copy the vent mark that is chalked on the outside onto the inside, onto the Silecia. We can also chalk up the crease, showing us where we need to sew later, so that's the 1 centimeter line we folded. So that's the 1 centimeter line we creased. We need to line up the vent marks now, and line up the raw edge of the top sleeve to the chalk line on the undersleeve. We are going to baste the sleeve seam. We need to move the cloth that is folded back on the top sleeve out of the way. We will tack just above the top of the vent. Then, without cutting the thread, we can come up through the fabric. We will stitch the vent of the top sleeve to the undersleeve. So we need to line the top sleeve up to the chalk line 1 centimeter inside of the sleeve, the original sleeve pattern that we drew onto the fabric. We'll tack the baste below the top of the vent, right on the edge of the fabric, and baste it down to the hem. I'm going to fold out the inlay on the top sleeve onto the button stand on the undersleeve and baste them together. It's important that the cuffs are sitting as we want them to when finished, but since we basted the vent together from the top of the vent to the hem, that shouldn't be a problem. I will also mark on the edge of the button stand and chalk a line perpendicular to the top of the vent so that I can machine along it. I start on the line that I just chalked, machining on the line up to the edge of the button stand that is marked on the inlay, using the reverse function on the machine to go back towards the seam, to the top of the vent, changing direction at the top of the vent and sewing up the sleeve with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. On the sample, we don't need the back tack at the top. Ironing over the machining, we can remove the basting holding the sleeve seam in place, but we can leave the basting holding the vent closed. With a sleeve board or whatever, we can press the sleeve seam open almost all the way to the top of the vent. It's more difficult when we have a sample, it's easier with the whole sleeve. We want to stretch the corner of the inlay on the undersleeve. We can wet it and pull it while under the iron. We want to fold over the seam so that the majority of the sleeve seam is open, but the vent and above the vent is on top of the other side. On a sleeve, it would be folded up to about the elbow, kinda only possible to do on a sleeve board or similar. We have our sleeve lining prepared, so we want to lay it under sleeve side up, so the side with the extended inlay on top. Then we'll lay the sleeve under sleeve side down onto it. We are laying them so that the undersleeves are against each other, so that the undersleeves are touching. We know that the top raw edges on this sample are flush, so we can line those up as well. In basically the same way, we also know that the lining should extend 5 centimeters lower than the cuff sleeve, so we could use that as well to make the two the correct height relative to each other. We are going to baste the seam allowances together. Sew the seam allowance of the lining to the furthest seam allowance on the cloth, so the top sleeve's seam allowances, not the undersleeves. Start with the seam that doesn't have the vent, going down to the top of the Silecia. Start at the top and moor the basting, binding the seam allowances. Move down the seam a few centimeters and basically tack through the seam allowances again. Between each tack, we don't want the basting to be tight, just kind of keep it loose between each one. Finish the bastes just above the Silecia. Use a pin through the lining seam allowance to the Silecia to keep the lining centered at the cuff. Do the same for the other seam allowances, except no pin, just stop a little above the vent. Do your final stitch through the twisting piece of cuff. This final tack in the baste will also hold the cuff together as well as holding the lining to the sleeve. At this point, I want to cut off the lining extending beyond the cuff, just cutting the lining flush with the hem. To line the vent, fold the cuff lining inlay of the undersleeve underneath itself so that it sits a little inside of the undersleeve button stand. We don't want to extend further than the edge. Fold it so that it sits where we want it to, covering the raw edges. We don't want the lining to pull or have too much excess. So, like I said, fold it to match where we want it to sit. Baste it to the undersleeve only, not all the way down though, as we'll need to turn the hem up about 4 or 5 centimeters above the hem. Turn the sleeve out by sticking your hand through the lining and pulling the sleeve through like that. Find where the top of the vent is and mark the point on the lining where the button stand ends. A couple of centimeters down from the top of the vent, cut into the top sleeve's lining, and before you become level with the edge of the button stand, start cutting diagonally up to the point that we marked as the intersecting point of the top of the vent and the edge of the button stand. Here I'm cutting away some of the excess lining that we don't need because we're going to fold this lining under itself so that it is next to the button stand. As I mentioned, with not backtacking this stitch on the lining, I'm pulling out some of the stitches so that I can fold the top part of the lining's vent horizontally, cutting away some of the excess as well. I'm folding it right up to the point we cut so that we can hide any raw edges and stray bits of grain. Cutting away a little bit of the thread from the machining there. Here I'm moving the pin we put in earlier to the right side of the lining, making sure the seams are lined up. Like I said when I cut the excess, we are folding the top sleeve lining under itself so that it isn't underneath the top sleeve, rather just next to it. With the pin there, we can pull out most of the excess lining, leaving a small amount of ease so that we can fold the lining in so that it sits where we want it. Once again, folding it such that the raw edges at the point that we cut to are as hidden as is feasible. From the machined seam, we are going to baste this part of the lining in place. Baste across the top of the overlap, still trying to keep the raw edges tucked away. With a sleeve board, we can just baste through everything. Tack when we change directions and baste down the top sleeve to about 4 or 5 centimeters above the hem so that we can still fold up the lining. We can remove the pin now. Around the cuff, mark 2 centimeters above the hem. Start on one side and fold the lining under itself to meet the line. We'll baste from about where we finished the other bastes, holding the edges in place and around the edge of the lining. Only baste the lining to the appropriate part of the sleeve, so if you have a board through the sleeve, you can basically baste through everything as you go around. Folding up the lining as you go, baste right on the edge of the lining, as we will fell stitch the lining on the edge later. And it's a nice attention to detail to line up the sleeve seams of the lining and main fabric, basting it all the way around, going up to meet the other baste. We can have a look at the sleeve now, removing the baste we made when we basted the sleeve seam before machining it, so that we can check that our surgeon cuff functions. To finish it, flip it lining side out again, starting on the undersleeve so that we can fasten our finishing thread underneath the currently basted top sleeve lining. Fill the lining to the cloth that we folded over, so only through the layer that the lining is touching. We might like to keep our hand between the button stand and the top sleeve so that we definitely don't accidentally seal the vent shut. At the bottom of the lining, just change direction and fill the edge of the lining to the folded up cuff only. We can't have the stitching showing on the outside. Like I said, it's a nice attention to detail to have the two seams lining up. At the other edge of the lining, we're changing direction, going back up the sleeve. We are still only filling to the layer of fabric that the lining is touching. I mean, you can sew through the Silecia as well, we just don't want the thread to be on the outside of the fabric. When we get to the corner up here, this is our last chance to push away any raw thread from the lining at the point we cut to. So if there's any more, then just deal with it here and seal it away with the felling stitches. Felling across the top of the vent, we should stitch through as much as possible without going through the outside layer of cloth. Turning the corner for the last time, try to fell only the two layers of lining together here, but so long as it doesn't show from the outside, it's all fine. We'll fell a little up the seam overlapping the machining that wasn't back-tacked. This way, the two lines of stitching will basically hold each other in place. This way we can just lose the tail of our thread between the lining and the cloth, and it won't be pulled out easily, leaving a fairly long tail, 3 to 5 centimeters. Since we're finished, we can take out all the basting. Not forgetting the basting that was used to hold the Silecia horizontally across the sleeve that's been there the longest. Now I'll show you where the buttons and buttonholes usually go. On a normal 4-button cuff like this one, the buttons usually start 3 centimeters from the edge of the cuff. Then each one is 15 millimeters up the sleeve from the last. With 15mm buttons, this means they are kissing buttons rather than overlapping, which are more common. They are usually 16mm from the seam, and the holes are usually 16mm wide. You saw that the half moon there really helps with the first buttonhole 3 centimeters from the hem. You can see that the far edge of the hole doesn't infringe on the lining on the top sleeve. Then the buttons go in the same places up the sleeve, still 16mm from the seam on the undersleeve. It's where the buttons are stood, that's why it's called the button stand.